what do we mean here by process? So this whole next section, I think, is really important from the bottom of page 3 to the kind of the middle of page 4.
This is where they develop their 3 syntheses, which is something Deleuze did in his own work. He loves these threes. He loves his pairs and he loves his threes. But the first synthesis is connective. It's the production of production. The second synthesis is disjunctive, the production of recording. The third synthesis is conjunctive, the production of consumption and consummation.
That's important and really well framed.
Okay.
I mean, I think this is everything that I'm talking about is of that first phase, let's say, of the production of the subject, the production of the colonial subject. Part of that production where one can locate the sort of the maker in the subject's unconscious is, this way in which lack is used to inferiorize the subject. And then in the analysis of the Black colonial subject, it manifests as an inferiority complex, a feeling that one isn't good enough, that one doesn't belong. In that moment where there's this confrontation, within the social field, I think it's evident that the way in which the Black colonial subject has been produced is to feel like they've done something wrong, like they are the violator, they're the oppressor, they're scary, right, and animal. In the infrastructure of the colonizer, we can find the Oedipal, the Oedipal relation or the triadic relation: daddy, mummy, me.
Mm-hmm. What do you think then is meant by the disjunctive? Because I was reading that in a couple of possible ways, either to kind of creatively break apart or the way that something imposes itself to break apart. Because part of the disjunctive is the production of recording. And I'm not quite sure I understand what they mean by recording, unless recording means anything that is documented or anything that is
that's what I'm talking
history
about, scripting or the self-inscriptive. The self-inscriptive would be to write oneself, it's auto-inventive in the sense that you're setting up the laws to do so. It's the performative power of stating that it is so. Like, for instance, Frantz Fanon's "I am my own foundation," as how he ends his Black Skin, White Masks. This kind of auto-institution and self-inscription is disruptive. So that seems like the disjunctive. And then it's conjunctive.
Yeah, the third is conjunctive.
In that it's now engaged in auto-invention. I think it's a rewriting of the subject. With it, which necessarily is a rewriting of the infrastructure, of the unconscious. The unconscious can be rewritten.
Well, so maybe I can pull some quotes that go to the second and the third. So on page 4, the second meaning of, so these are all syntheses of process, because remember your question was, what do we mean by process? So these are the 3 syntheses of process. So the second meaning of process, which is disjunctive, production and recording. And the quote is, "We make no distinction between man and nature. Industry is then no longer considered from the extrinsic point of view of utility. Rather, all forms are in contact. Man is not the king of creation. Man and nature are not opposing terms." So I think it's trying to break this. It's trying to disjoin the subject from what we say is natural, which is hitting on some of the things you're saying there.
Yeah, it's self-disassembly, or it's unmaking. It's a phase of or a stage of unmaking.
Okay, so then the third meaning of process. So this would be the conjunctive, the production of consumption or consummation. Third meaning of process, quote, page 5, "It must not be viewed as a goal or an end in itself, nor infinitely perpetuating itself." Quote, "Putting an end to the process or prolonging it indefinitely is what creates the artificial schizophrenic found in mental institutions, an entirely separate and independent entity." Okay, so I think this is where the schizophrenic comes in. We have to cure the schizophrenic. We have to remove the problem, right? But then I think what they're trying to suggest is that in schizophrenia, it's almost a decision to create another layer of movement. So if we look at some of the things that they say about the schizophrenic, The schizophrenic, page 15, has his own system of coordinates for situating himself at his disposal. He has his very own recording code, which does not coincide with the social code. So he kind of messes with it. Delirium or desire becomes fluid. The schizophrenic passes from one code to another, deliberately scrambles all the codes by shifting through them, never giving the same explanation, never invoking the same genealogy. And it's interesting they use the word genealogy because that's what I thought of. Never recording the same event in the same way. So this is the body without organs taking on organs and continues to be, as they say, quote unquote, slippery. So I just love this. I think this is the schizophrenic is someone who has decided that enough is enough, and I need to create a new code. I need to layer on top of this other reality something that makes sense to me, as a way of breaking up a word that they don't use, but we have talked about, ideology, of what is something like what you're suggesting is white supremacy, or, the kind of colonial unconscious. So back to page 5, quote, schizophrenia is like love. There is no specifically schizophrenic phenomenon or entity. Schizophrenia is the universe of productive and reproductive desiring machines.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think they're talking about, kind of making, like, breaking the rule by making a new machine that kind of fucks with the associations.
Yeah. I mean, this is the way in which the production process is being changed, and the subject is rewriting themselves.
Exactly.
But still kind of
but also rewriting the whole at the same time, by rewriting the self, rewriting, ideas.
Yeah. Which for their sort of application and freeing the subject from whatever infrastructures don't allow it to have as much power as it wants, which feels like freedom, the freedom to. And I think this whole question of freedom within this, I think is a strange thing to bring up, because they don't really use that language.
No, but freedom is an interesting element when we think about bodies without organs, because a key element of bodies without organs is that you cannot fully extract yourself from the body.
Yeah.
So you can rewrite, you can re-record, I guess, you can create a line of flight, you can escape, but you're always still tied to the organism. You can't be totally free from it. Because the problem of, if you have total freedom, it would fold you back into the system. You would just be molecularly dispersed, and then that would get reintegrated back into the matrix of normal. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that's where we get into his discussion of the fragmentary.
Freedom is always incomplete. It's always in a process of becoming, and it's always affective. So it has to mutate. It has to constantly mutate. Freedom has to constantly mutate and change within the system. This is part of the bodies without organs concept. So I think then that schizoanalysis is the breaking up of, if we want to say the, back to desire, if there's productive desire that is against fascism's repression of desire, and here I'm reminded of Nietzsche's reactive and active forces, which you and I have talked about in the past, from his book on Nietzsche, from Deleuze's book on Nietzsche. I can't remember when that book was written. That was one of his earlier books, so this would be later. But schizoanalysis is maybe a practice of this, a practice of breaking up fascism's reactivity, fascism's repression of desire through its mechanisms, through its infrastructure.
I'm on page 26 where they talk about the subject and desire. So I was talking earlier about how, the real is produced, and maybe we could speak of the virtual as the infrastructure, or the virtual having an infrastructure that's then made real or produced. But yeah, this thing. So he writes, desire does not lack anything, does not lack its object.
Right.
It's rather the subject that is missing in desire that lacks a fixed subject. There is no fixed subject unless there is repression. And so there's something which one cannot have, right? And the know from, the fathers know from within oneself. If we're talking about within the triadic structure, what force is at play, or within the triadic, what's the distribution of forces at play within the father's know. But there's no fixed subject without it. But that's also that there is no fixed subject without that is part of what frees up the subject to remake itself, to rewrite itself. and to move into that next phase or stage.
Yeah, I think the key word there is fixity. Again, reading your quote, it is rather the subject that is missing in desire, or desire that lacks a fixed subject. There is no fixed subject unless there is repression. So repression happens in at least the way I'm reading this, the subject that is immobile, that is kind of, I guess, molar, maybe
Yeah.
to use Deleuze's term.
Yeah, I think the know within, right, that then directs the subject. But I think it's just that what we can't do is shapes us, then, and within that, what we do, it remains, as you're saying, unfixed, right? That part is, unactualized or is engaged in unfixed ways, in other simultaneous to this production of the fixed subject. Is simultaneous to the repression. There might also be some way in which the subject is satisfying what it wants.
Exactly. And that's all of the commodities and all of the commerce that we
are
awash in. And the logic of capitalism, to go back to that, the ideology that says that this is capitalism that's giving you your life, right? So, yeah, I just want to kind of return to those three syntheses again, then, since we've been discussing them with you. It seems like to me, so the first one is, let's think of these syntheses in terms of capitalism. So the first one would be make all the connections, right? Do all the right things. And again, I'm not sure if I'm reading this right, but this is kind of, maybe you can help me with this, but it feels like the first synthesis would be then doing the thing of making the connection, the production of production. And then the second synthesis would be kind of breaking away from you use the word infrastructure. Maybe we can think of the conveyor belt of connectivity and recording something different. And then the third synthesis would be kind of not getting outside of capitalism, but writing, like producing something that makes other connections than the assembly line of capitalism. I don't know if that makes any sense. That just popped into my head.
Yeah, and within the third process, one of the examples of that is the fragmentary and the fragmented. So the bottom of page 5, desire constantly couples continuous flows and partial objects that are by nature fragmentary and fragmented. Desire causes the current to flow. Itself flows in turn and breaks the flows. Then he goes back to Henry Miller and that sort of analysis of flows. But then, his discussion of the fragmentary, I think within, if we're talking about what's unfixed is in a fragmentary state to in a either unrealized or partially realized or still virtual sort of state. But there's energy there. There's still intensity there. It's not without activation. It's just it's repressed or it's unexpressed, but it remains in a state of sort of applying pressure or force. So it's, we can think of that as the white spaces in writing, or the unsaids,
right.
Which, or, within fragmentary writing, the white spaces between, but then, that white space between has to be in relation to those forces, those unspoken, unsaid, unspeakable too sometimes because of disaster, catastrophe, those things that can't be said. Those things that can't be said yet too because infrastructure doesn't permit it, or because society in defense of itself doesn't permit it, because of one's own precarity to, as a speaking subject, which, is threatened to remain silent concerning all that would expose the delirium, would expose the mechanism of occultation or what's behind the curtain. The awes of the infrastructure is maybe we can talk about that and sort of within as a way of applying this analysis to look at sort of capitalism. So this is, they're doing that the capitalist is schizophrenic, right? Because that's what charges the system. The schizophrenic, manifests, the capitalists manifest many of the same within the whole and part system. In their discussion of schizes, they talk about the way in which this, schizophrenia is really the condition of the capitalist subject.
Can you riff on that some more? Because I was taking the schizophrenic as the one who is able to escape capitalism.
Yes, but they're a capitalist subject before they can escape it. What they're escaping is the capitalist subject.
Okay, I got you. Yeah.
But that same
And that
possibility
the
is
condition of,
available to all capitalists, but it's also produced within capitalism.
yeah. So it also sets up the possibility.
Yeah, it's like the seed of opposition is always in the culture, right?
Exactly.
It's whatever is programmed there is, which oppresses us. There's also that same lever is the one that you can press to gain one's independence or freedom. And for Fanon, it's by way of violence, right? That's what he observes. That's how the colonial subject gets free. To use the violent, the violence of the colonizer is the only language the colonizer speaks. So you have to speak in the language of the colonizer for them to listen. But I think that same relation is sort of like the relation between the son and the father too, within the Oedipal structure, and then with the relation of the colonial subject with themselves, because that's how they've been formed. So to reform themselves, they have to step out of that triadic structure. The third synthesis is, sets up the voyage, but then, that subject's going to have to be disassembled too. All assembled subjects are disassembled, and I think that's where we get to catastrophe or disaster or heartbreak, whatever. I think many things can bring about those disconnections from oneself or disassociations, or sort of the way in which the schizophrenic sort of produces themselves to protect themselves and to go, as it were, into a kind of state of maroonage in order to then come back and reassemble themselves in a way that, was the revolutionary phase. That's Haiti in, the late 1790s, becoming, an independent country, but then setting itself up as part of France still, and keeping the infrastructure because it feels safe. It feels familiar to be under a father's, under a kind of, within that triadic structure, under a father's power, under the threat of the father's no.
Right.
Which then,
which is law.
You self-produced by, your own no that you say to yourself.
Well, and by the structure of law and order and civilization.
Yeah, and then it becomes so, and then by it becoming so, by it being written, it's what everyone needs to abide by. Like, take affirmative action. What happens if it's if it's overturned, right? Like if there's a new precedent set, we have a new program. There's a new law that institutions need to abide by, or in businesses, organizations, human relations are going to be organized differently. And then we could ask, to whose advantage? And I think that's when we would start doing a sort of ethno-class analysis, like Winter has in mind.